The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local community-centered journalism today by signing up to be a monthly sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. It doesn't take much money to support local news.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning, CHY's current affairs show. I'm Laura McKenzie. The struggle to find affordable housing is something many people are facing, both young and old, in British Columbia and across Canada. To help alleviate this stress, the provincial government recently introduced new changes to short-term rentals throughout BC. This move is meant to help bring back more long-term housing opportunities for renters. The government has stated that BC is facing a housing crisis, with a shortage of all forms of attainable housing, including long-term rentals. Many short-term rental listings are found on popular services such as Airbnb and Vrbo. Starting May 1st, 2024, British Columbians will legally only be able to rent out their primary residence. In addition to their primary residence, they will also be able to either rent out their secondary suite or an accessory dwelling unit as a short-term rental on the same property. Currently in Nanaimo, if you're to rent out a short-term rental, you would need to obtain a business license. Within the new rules, local governments will get stronger tools to enforce short-term rental bylaws. In regional districts, the maximum potential fine will increase from $2,000 to $50,000, in line with that of municipalities. Tourism Nanaimo told CHY that currently there is around 1,072 listings on Airbnb in the city, and between 2018 and 2023, there has been a 70% increase in listings. There is also roughly 1,510 rooms between hotels, motels, and seasonal housing like dorms at VIU in the city. Hotels and motels will not be affected by the new rules. We reached out to Airbnb for a statement. In an email, Alex Howell, policy manager for Airbnb Canada, states, "The BC government's proposed legislation won't alleviate the province's housing concerns. Instead, it will take money out of the pockets of British Columbians, make travel more unaffordable for millions of residents who travel within BC, and reduce tourism spending in communities where hosts are often the only providers of local accommodations." Today, I speak with Mark Holland, consultant and VIU professor of the Masters of Community Planning program, to talk us through what is happening with the new changes and what we can expect to see as it takes place. I also speak with Mayor of Nanaimo, Leonard Krogh, about his thoughts and how this is going to affect residents in the city. Finally, I wrap things up with Executive Director Carly Paraboom at Tourism Nanaimo about how the loss of short-term rentals could affect the tourism industry in Nanaimo. So with that, let's jump into it. Hello, Mark. Welcome to Midcoast Morning. Currently, there's been a lot of changes to short-term rental rules in the province. Can you explain to us what's happening?
Yeah, short-term rentals is a really interesting piece of cities and city functions and city land uses that emerged kind of through the back door of the digital revolution and largely the development of Airbnb and then other platforms that are somewhat similar to it. There have been other uses for much longer, such as, vacation rental by owner, Vrbo as we know it, and other platforms, but they've never had the same kind of impact that the digital Airbnb and its, other similar programs have had. What these basically did was they started as a way for a homeowner to rent a bedroom in their house. That was really the original kind of vision. And I think some of them humorously were actually, you can sleep on the couch because we're starving students. And yeah, sure. If you want to pay us to sleep on the couch, you can sleep on the couch. That'll help everybody. Obviously, it took off and has now become, a major global, massive global corporation traded on the stock exchanges, et cetera, and has had a very big impact on communities around the world. So that's essentially the background of where we find ourselves. When it was small, like pretty much anything that was small, that is small, it doesn't have a noticeable impact. People generally don't spend a lot of time thinking about it until it gets big. And this is what's happened, is that we now have, hundreds of thousands of units rented across any, province or country, millions in some cases, thousands in many communities. And if we did have plenty of rental housing and other housing available, we wouldn't be having this conversation because it wouldn't be a factor. But the rise of the short-term rentals occurred basically concurrently with several different forces that changed the housing supply in our cities. About 25 years ago, the planning world, maybe 30 years ago, the world of community and city planners really jumped on, and politicians jumped on the smart growth bandwagon, which essentially said our cities shouldn't sprawl. And so we're not going to allow our cities to expand physically into the surrounding areas very often. Instead, we're going to try and start putting a lot more people in the existing city footprint. So what this means is then we probably need to take down existing homes. In some cases, there was, well, for about 10 or 15 years, there was still empty land within many city boundaries because they had been systematically expanding their boundaries more often. And when they stopped doing that, it took a while, but we ended up using up all that spare land. So in the case of Nanaimo, when they began to shut down the boundaries and not expand them, we still had all that area far out on Bruce, out to 10th, there was empty land. And so today, when you drive out there past VIU and out, head south, it's all built out now. So this is kind of what we've been doing in cities all across North America, is we basically built out all the empty land to a large degree that was in many of them. We then started putting in much higher density work, buildings, towers, and other things, except those are very expensive to build. They take a long time to build. And so in terms of absorbing growth, they absorb growth fairly well, but not as well as many people think they do, because it takes 10 plus years to get a tower. So what we've ended up with is the Airbnb rise and the short-term rental rise has taken off, and it's now eaten up thousands of units in many cities for what we would call a hotel use, or in planning, we call it tourist accommodation or hospitality uses. The challenge with that is that it, concurrent with the shutdown of new and cheap land, meant that the housing supply became actually a lot smaller than it used to be. We've simply not been building enough houses. And the reason why your generation has to spend so much on housing is because of that. So if we had loads and loads of housing and it kept building at the usual rate or a greater rate, and just eating up land next door and carrying on, then we probably wouldn't be having the conversation about Airbnb. But now we're having to look at all the reasons why there's not enough housing, so that it's a real challenge for students like yourself and your colleagues to find a place. So what's happened now is that across many of the cities in the world that are dealing with this, particularly North America, where a lot of everybody jumped on the smart growth bandwagon, Australia, and other areas. Yeah, so we're now looking at ways to bring rental housing back onto the market and take it away from this temporary, basically hotel use. So that's sort of the situation we're in, and everybody's taking a slightly different tack on it. Some cities have led the way, like say Victoria and others, which basically outlawed them a long time ago. Other ones, it's still fine. In Nanaimo, all you need is a business license. So it varies, but the province came to power. This current government came to power on a commitment to bring housing. And so they are looking at every lever they can get to bring housing. And they're just starting to release a whole series of major programs that are going to forever alter neighborhoods. And this is one of them. They're essentially clamping down, not on Airbnb in its original form. They're supporting Airbnb in its original form. So if you've got an extra bedroom in your house, you can rent that out on Airbnb. If you live in a very small community, I think it's below 10,000 people, which is actually a reasonable sized community, then you're also exempt. And if you're part of major tourist destinations like Whistler, Tofino, and others, then you're also exempt as well. But in the major cities, Victoria, Nanaimo, Vancouver, some of the larger cities, they're saying, nope, we're not, there's hotels there and people should stay in hotels, not in houses that have been taken out of long-term rental to be managed as mini hotels. So that's really what they're going after, is people who rent a house or rent an apartment that they don't live in and just rent it out as a hotel room. That's really what they're trying to take out.
And what can we expect to see with these new changes?
So I think there's going to be a number of implications from this change. The first one is that we will probably see a reasonable increase in the availability of rental, long-term rental for renters in the cities. How much we see will depend on a number of factors. For owners of or managers of these rental units, where their financial commitment to those units is such that they need the maximum amount of money that can come from Airbnb in order to even make it work financially, those probably won't come back into the market, because they'll be put on the market to sell, because a long-term renter doesn't pay quite as much as a whole series of short-term renters, although that depends on how much on which community you're in, how much money you can get for it. So I think we will see a surge of rental units for long-term rental come back into the market from this, for people who need the rental income and can figure out how to survive with the slightly reduced income of a long-term renter rather than a whole bunch of short-term Airbnb renters. So we'll see some of that. The ones that have more financial challenges to them will probably not come back into the rental market. They're going to be sold to people who buy them. What's of interest is that in previous generations, mine and folks who are older than us, the cost of housing was low enough that we could afford to invest in that housing and be landlords and actually make it work financially. So you save up enough to get the down payment, and then you manage it as a landlord. And over time, the renters pay off that house, and then you have, something for your retirement left there when you get old after they've paid off the mortgage. That doesn't really work very well today. So almost nobody's doing that anymore. And the reason why is that housing is so expensive that the size of down payment it takes to bring the mortgage payment down, mortgage plus insurance and taxes and utilities, all the things that it costs to own a home or apartment, to bring those down to a level that the renter, even at high rents, covers, so you don't have to keep adding money every month. That down payment is so large now that it doesn't make any financial sense to do that. And so what we'll see in the units that folks either owned, let's say folks owned and rented out on Airbnb, if they can't do that now, many of them are just going to sell the units. And what happens then is an owner moves in most of the time, because it doesn't make financial sense to put try and save or borrow $500,000 for a down payment and then also have to pay mortgages on top of that. It just doesn't work financially for people. They're better off to take their money and invest it in the stock market, because they don't have to deal with that. And then they don't also have to deal with being a landlord. I'm a landlord myself. My wife and I this is how we've saved for our retirement, because we don't have any pensions. And being a landlord is a very, very time consuming, expensive, and can be very, very frustrating experience. So if you don't have to do that, you just buy exchange traded fund on the stock market and get as good or better returns, and you don't have to, put this huge down payment down, then that's a far better way to manage money. So we're going to see a lot of the Airbnb units come into the purchase market. So that may then bring down the price temporarily. I don't think it's a long-term solution, but it will level off, maybe even reduce the price of some types of rental homes, because there'll be that many more for sale of that group of people that decide to sell it. And because you can't really buy it to rent it anymore, it'll be bought by people who move in. Now, those people may be renters themselves now. This may be their chance to move from rental into purchase. So let's say they're in their late 30s, early 40s, and they've been saving money and they paid off some of their student loans or all of them, and they're ready to go. And suddenly we get a little flood of these surfaces, of these units, then they may free up some rental units. So I think the knock-on effect will be that there will be an increase in rental units available from them as well. But it's hard to predict exactly how that plays itself out, because interest rates are pretty high right now. So we're not quite sure what the implications would be. One other implication that I'll note, it has to do with tourism. So, some of the folks that listen to your program may work in tourism or serve tourists. I think one of the downsides of this move is that we're essentially taking literally thousands, maybe even 10,000 hospitality units out of circulation. And so the reality of this is going to be the need to start building hotels and motels, because Airbnb filled up the gap that otherwise would have driven the demand for new hotels and motels. And so when it can take a long time to get those built, and they're expensive to build. So I think we're going to see a major impact potentially in the tourism industry, of where a whole lot of people now suddenly have to pay a lot more money. And frankly, there just aren't even any homes available, or hotel rooms or motel rooms. Nanaimo doesn't have a lot of motel and hotel rooms. And a lot of people who live in them are workers that kind of live there for much longer term. So I think we're going to see a big demand increase for hotel and motel rooms because of that. So I think there's going to be a negative impact on the tourism industry by taking all of these tourist accommodation rooms out of play. And it's going to take a decade to recover from that or more. So I think the tourism industry is going to feel an impact. And I expect that some buildings that may have been built with lots of small units for the purpose of renting them out on Airbnb may need to go to the city and have them rezoned from residential to allow them to continue to operate as Airbnb units. And the city may agree with that in order to not have that big a negative impact on the tourism industry. So this is going to be the balance we have ahead of us, the impact on tourism versus the impact on long-term rental. And that's going to be the trade-off that we watch play itself out over the next couple of years.
Do you believe these changes will be sustainable for Nanaimo?
I'm in favor of this move generally, because I think that as a city planner, when we're doing city plans, we locate hotels and motels and tourist accommodation in specific areas, and they aren't necessarily that friendly to residential areas, particularly if you're renting a 7-bedroom house and partiers are there. Like, that's a hotel, and that doesn't belong where people are trying to have their children sleep for school the next day. So I think this is the right long-term direction to go. It's just going to have a short-term negative impact on tourism that's going to need to be managed. And the province has ways and the city have ways of helping, compensate for that, but there will be a big shift here. That being said, in the case of Nanaimo, with about a 1% rental vacancy rate for folks like students at VIU, in other words, we need to get a lot more rental housing on the market in order to make your lives much more sustainable long-term. And I think there's other ways we can deal with the tourism industry besides making your cost of living impossible to handle. So I think this is the right positive direction to go, but all changes have some implications, and that's going to be the challenge of the next few years.
Thank you, Mark, for your time.
Thanks, Lauren. A pleasure.
Midcoast Morning is made possible by the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Support Midcoast Morning and CHOI's nonprofit newsroom today by becoming a sustaining donor at choi.ca/donate. Local news can't survive without your support. Another way to help us out is to share this show with your friends and tell them why they should support us. Finally, if you're listening to the podcast edition of Midcoast Morning, go and give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast feed you use. It helps people find us.
I had a chance to speak with Mayor of Nanaimo, Leonard Krogh, about short-term rentals and get his thoughts on the changes. Here's the interview. So what is your perspective on the recent announcement from the province to rein in short-term rentals?
The city had already taken significant steps around the issue of short-term rentals in terms of regulation. I think it's very interesting. There was a piece in the Times Columbians this morning that was very critical of the city of Victoria, which, if I accept the contents of the article, indicated that they had basically encouraged that kind of use. I think it's one of the many tools the government is trying to use to encourage housing to go back into the marketplace. But I don't know that it's going to reduce prices, candidly. What we really need is a significant, even more significant investment than the government has already undertaken in what I will call public housing. In other words, housing that is supported by or rents that are subsidized by the provincial and federal governments. I don't think you're going to bring down the price of housing realistically, and the need is enormous.
And in your opinion, will this have an effect on housing availability in Nanaimo?
It may have an impact, but not as much as probably some would hope for. But as I say, it's one of the many tools the provincial government is trying to employ to promote more available housing for people. But it's pretty clear that we are also, as a city, ahead of the targets we need for housing. It's still not enough because of the historical backlog. But, I think we're shooting for 1,155 housing units. And last year, I think we built 1,370. And when I say we, they were built in the city. The city's not building the housing per se. So if we can keep that up, that will certainly help over the longer haul. But that won't get past the guts of the issue for many, indeed, if not most people. It's not just a question of whether the unit is available. It's whether or not they can afford the rent that's being charged.
And will council receive a report from staff on its impact in Nanaimo in the near future?
Oh, yes. I mean, when we brought in the regulations, we were going, staff have been asked, as they are with any changes to bylaws, et cetera, to review and provide timely reports back to council. I can't tell you when, but no, we don't just make a change, throw it out there and forget about it.
How do you think these changes will impact tourism in Nanaimo, as many tourists will be staying in Airbnbs when they visit Nanaimo?
Well, that's a difficult one to assess, because how can you tell who didn't come to Nanaimo because they could no longer access a B&B. Our hotel numbers obviously dropped. Our occupancy rates dropped significantly during COVID. They've come back up. The hospitality industry has faced some really grim times. I'm hopeful this won't have a significant negative impact on that industry, because whether or not people stay in an Airbnb or a hotel room, they come to Nanaimo and they spend money, and that supports our economy, and that's a good thing.
Thank you for your time.
Yep, no problem. Keep well. Cheers.
That was Mayor Nanaimo Leonard Krogh about what we could expect in Nanaimo when the number of short-term rentals start to decrease. Now we speak with Carly Paraboom, the Executive Director at Tourism Nanaimo, to get a perspective on how these changes could affect the tourism industry in Nanaimo. Hello Carly, welcome to Midcoast Morning. Today we are talking about the changes in short-term rentals and how there's going to be less of a number of Airbnbs and other short-term rentals in the city. I was wondering what your thoughts are on how this is going to affect the tourism industry in Nanaimo.
Well, I think first it's probably more important to look at a bit of the numbers, right? Like right now, when we look at hotel rooms or motels, we have around 1,500 of those in Nanaimo. And in comparison, we have just a little over 1,000 listings for Airbnb. So like to put that in some sort of comparison or term, that's basically from 2018 to 2023, it's like a 70.3% increase in Airbnb listings. And so when we're looking at the destination and we're trying to manage it and trying to understand capacity and what the drivers will be, really seeing tighter Airbnb regulations could lead to kind of leveling out the field between traditional hotels and Airbnb hosts. Currently hotels pay large overhead. They have substantial taxes that they pay. They employ a vast workforce. And the same couldn't really necessarily be said for Airbnbs, which essentially are acting as ghost hotels within the community, right? Obviously, travel behavior has changed, and people have a preference somewhat for Airbnbs. And I think to some capacity, those will still exist under the new regulations, but it's definitely going to be striking a balance between consumer need and then also the economic benefits to the community and to the industry overall. But I mean, it's a really nuanced, I think, situation that we're dealing with, because Airbnb is also taking housing off of the market, right? And so short-term rentals are increasing, but our housing shortage becomes exponentially worse.
Do you believe hotels in Nanaimo will be able to handle the increased number of people that will switch from using Airbnbs to using hotels?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think the specific impact on destination capacity really will depend, like, as you said, to the enforcement of the new regulations and which ones are already going to kind of work within the new regulations. I think it gives the opportunity for us to see more demand within the sector, which then could actually increase investment, which, because Airbnb is there and taking up a large majority of visitors, we haven't necessarily been able to make the argument for like an economic reason for people to reinvest into the hotel sector. So I think currently we're sitting in a really good position, and I think a lot of the properties that are listed on Airbnb will potentially go offline. But I think that as it stands right now, the community would be able to handle the increase that it would be driving towards hotels in the short term.
Okay, and do you believe that these changes will be sustainable for the tourism industry in Nanaimo?
I mean, time will tell. That's a bit of a hard question, right? Like, you can't really necessarily see into a crystal ball. I think in some areas of the province, these changes will have a huge effect on tourism capacity and how they're going to be able to support a thriving visitor economy. At the same time, many of our communities are facing huge housing shortages, which adversely affect our ability to then also attract the seasonal workers that we need for the industry. So it's kind of a catch-22. I think there needs to be a balance. I think time will kind of tell what these regulations will really mean for the sector overall. And it's going to mean something different for each community. I think right now Nanaimo is in a good position. We do have inventory here, especially in the summer months. A lot of people don't necessarily think about the fact that the university housing also comes online in the summer. And so that adds to our capacity in a way that's not necessarily understood, I would say, maybe by the general public. But that definitely is something that we're keeping a close eye on.
Will tourism in Nanaimo be watching how the loss of short-term rentals will affect the industry?
Absolutely. I mean, we use a software called AirDNA, which essentially tracks all Airbnbs across the city, and we're constantly monitoring that data. We're looking at that to understand travel behavior. We're looking at that to understand the needs that people are looking for when they're traveling to the destination. And also it helps us to understand what the long-term demand is and where there could be potential for hoteliers. So we'll continue to track that and really make sure that we're keeping our community informed, obviously our municipality, but also our accommodation sector and partners.
Carly, thank you for your time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much.
That was our story for the day. Thank you to Mark Holland, Mayor Leonard Krogh, and Carly Paraboom for joining me today. I'm Laura McKenzie, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and Arby Frew is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHOY's newsletter at choi.ca/subscribe for updates from our news department and more. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band, Waste Management. You can find more of the music on their Bandcamp. Support local artists by buying their music. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, email us at news@choi.ca.
Midcoast Morning would not be possible without the funding of the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Midcoast Morning is a project of CHOY's nonprofit newsroom. Support nonprofit journalism in Nanaimo and on the Salish Sea today by becoming a monthly sustaining donor at $5 or more per month. Support the program at choi.ca/donate. If you're already a supporter, record a voice memo telling others where you're listening from and why they too should support our work. After you're done, you can email it to us. Also, share the podcast with your friends. While Meta is blocking Canadian users from sharing news content on their Facebook feeds, you can still share our podcast directly with your friends via Facebook or Instagram Messenger. Finally, this program acknowledges and gives thanks to the Snuneymuxw First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.